The bank manager's hand froze in midair when he saw the passbook. For a moment, the air between us felt unnaturally still, as if the hum of the fluorescent lights had dropped an octave. His fingers tightened around the worn green cover, the edges frayed and soft from decades of use. He looked up at me not with curiosity, but with something closer to alarm. "This," he said carefully, lowering his voice, "was not supposed to be destroyed." I nodded once, calm on the surface, my pulse steady only because I'd already lived this moment in my mind 100 times. The chair beneath me was cold, the vinyl cracked at the seams. Across the desk, the manager adjusted his glasses, eyes darting toward the glass wall of his office as if someone might overhear. What I didn't say, what I couldn't say yet, was that my mother had tried very hard to make sure no one ever saw that passbook again. The smell of old paper rose faintly from it, familiar and unsettling. My grandfather's handwriting still marked the inside cover, neat and deliberate, dated more than 30 years earlier. I traced the letters with my eyes, feeling the echo of his presence the way one feels a memory in the bones. The manager cleared his throat. "Before we continue," he said, "I need to ask you something. How did this come back to you?" I leaned back slightly, folding my hands in my lap. For the first time since I'd walked into the bank, I allowed myself a breath. "That," I said, "is a longer story." What I didn't know then was that this quiet office, this pause, this question, was the first visible crack in a lie my family had been maintaining for years. My grandfather raised me for most of my childhood, though no one ever framed it that way. Officially, I lived with my parents. In reality, I spent my afternoons and weekends in his small, meticulously kept house at the edge of town. He believed in routines, in saving receipts, in writing things down. He believed that if you planned carefully enough, you could protect the people you loved from chaos. My mother hated that about him. She called it obsession, said he didn't trust anyone, said he was old-fashioned in the tone people use when they really mean controlling. I learned early not to contradict her. My father rarely did either. When my grandfather died, it was sudden enough to feel intentional, like the end of a sentence cut short. A stroke, they said, no warning, no final conversations. The house was cleared within weeks, furniture donated, papers burned. I was 22, still grieving, still assuming that adults told the truth about these things. At the reading of the will, my mother cried quietly and held my hand. She told me he'd left everything to her, that it was simpler that way. She said he'd trusted her to take care of me. I believed her. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that there had been something else. Something small enough to hide, something easy to dismiss. A passbook. She found it while cleaning his study. I learned that much later from an offhand comment she didn't realize mattered. She said it like a joke, like an inconvenience. "Your grandfather kept the strangest junk," she laughed once. "Old bank books, expired cards, I threw most of it away." I remember the sound of the trash bag tearing as she described it. At the time, I felt nothing but mild irritation. People grieve differently, I told myself. She was doing what she needed to do. What I didn't realize was that resentment had already taken root, quiet, patient, waiting for proof. Years passed. Life moved forward. I worked, saved, struggled in small, ordinary ways. My mother controlled the family finances with a precision that left no room for questions. If I asked, she reminded me of everything she'd given up to raise me. It wasn't until a casual conversation with one of my grandfather's old friends, a retired accountant with an inconvenient memory, that the ground beneath me shifted. He asked if I'd ever accessed the account. I laughed, confused. "What account?" I asked. His silence answered me before his words did, and that was when I understood something fundamental. My mother hadn't just thrown something away. She deburied it, and she'd assumed it would stay that way. I didn't confront my mother after that conversation, not immediately. I thanked my grandfather's friend, smiled politely, and let the question hang in the air between us as if it were nothing more than a misunderstanding. I had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only taught people where to hide things better. What kind of account? I asked him instead, my voice neutral. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Savings, long-term. Your grandfather was very particular about it, said it wasn't for emergencies, said it was for you." The word landed with more weight than it should have. I drove home slowly that evening, windows down, letting the noise of the city dull the sharpness of my thoughts. My mind replayed small moments from childhood, my grandfather insisting I watch him balance his checkbook, the way he'd explained compound interest as if it were a moral lesson. He once told me, very calmly, that money was only dangerous when people lied about it. At the time, I'd thought it was just another one of his rules. When I walked into my parents' house, my mother was at the kitchen table, papers spread around her like a controlled spill. She looked up and smiled, the practiced expression she used when she felt secure. "You're late," she said. "I ran into someone," I replied, setting my keys down. One of Grandpa's old friends. Her hand paused for a fraction of a second before she stacked the papers more neatly. It was the kind of pause you only notice once you know to look for it. "Oh," she said. "Anyone I know?" "Maybe," I said. He asked me something odd. She waited. He asked if I'd ever accessed Grandpa's account. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic, it was careful. My mother reached for her mug, took a sip, and nodded as if I'd commented on the weather. "He had accounts all over the place," she said. "Most of them were closed years ago. Don't let old men confuse you." I watched her closely. Her tone was dismissive, but her jaw had tightened. I felt a familiar pressure in my chest, not anger yet, but something closer to confirmation. "What about a passbook?" I asked. She laughed, sharp and quick. "God, he loved those things, completely obsolete." "You threw them away?" I asked. "Of course," she said. "Why would I keep clutter?" There it was, no hesitation this time, no apology. I nodded, letting the subject die exactly where she wanted it to. That night, lying in my childhood room, I stared at the ceiling and let myself remember things I'd been trained to forget. The way she'd insisted on being executor, the speed with which the house had been emptied, the way any mention of my grandfather's habits had been reframed as inconvenience. What I didn't know then was how deliberate it had all been. I started quietly, no accusations, no demands. I pulled bank statements from my own accounts, traced timelines, learned the difference between closed and dormant accounts. I spent evenings at the public library, reading about legacy savings products my grandfather's generation favored, accounts designed to sit untouched, unassuming, waiting. Each discovery added weight to a suspicion I still refused to name aloud. The real turning point came weeks later in my parents' attic. My mother had asked me to help her look for tax documents. As I moved boxes, I noticed one pushed far back, taped shut, unlabeled. Inside were things she claimed to hate: old receipts, manuals, envelopes yellowed with age. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a cloth, was the passbook. I held it carefully as if it might bruise. The cover was creased, the spine worn smooth by my grandfather's hands. It wasn't destroyed. It wasn't thrown away, it had been hidden. In that moment, something settled inside me, not rage, not triumph, but clarity. My mother hadn't acted out of grief or convenience. She made a decision. She looked at something meant for me and decided it should disappear. What I didn't yet understand was how far she'd gone to make that disappearance permanent, or how many people had helped her. I put the passbook back exactly where I found it, and I began to plan. I didn't tell anyone about the passbook. Not my father, not my friends, not even myself, not in words that would make it real. I treated it the way you treat a fragile truth, acknowledged silently, protected carefully, and never exposed to people who might try to reshape it. Instead, I began to learn. The passbook itself was old-fashioned, but not useless. Each entry was handwritten, dates aligned with deposits my grandfather could only have made deliberately. There were long gaps between them, years sometimes, but the balance grew steadily. What caught my attention wasn't the amount, though it was more than I'd ever imagined. It was the final notation, a stamp, a code I didn't recognize. I photographed it, returned the book to the attic, and left the house as if nothing had changed. Over the following weeks, I built a quiet routine. Mornings at work, evenings at the library, weekends spent reading banking regulations and legacy account policies. I learned how institutions treated dormant accounts, how passbooks were logged, and how ownership was verified when the original holder had died. Most importantly, I learned how often families assumed accounts were gone simply because someone said they were. What I didn't know then was whether my mother believed her own story. The bank my grandfather used still existed, though it had been absorbed into a larger institution. I didn't go there immediately. I waited. Timing matters when you want the truth documented, not dismissed. When I finally walked into the branch, I did so as a granddaughter seeking clarity, not restitution. I brought my identification, my grandfather's death certificate, and a photocopy of the passbook, never the original. I'd learned enough by then to understand the power of originals. The woman at the desk was polite but cautious. She typed slowly, asked careful questions, and excused herself twice to consult someone in the back. When she returned, she said the words I'd been preparing for. "This account shouldn't exist," she said. I nodded. "But it does." She looked at me more closely then. "It's marked as inactive," she said, "but not closed. There's no record of withdrawal." I waited. "And there's a note," she added, "an internal note from years ago." My pulse stayed steady. "What does it say?" She hesitated. "That the account holder instructed the bank not to release information to anyone except the named beneficiary, even family, especially family." I almost smiled. "Who is the beneficiary?" I asked, though I already knew. She turned the screen slightly. "You are." That was the moment I allowed myself a breath, but relief is never the end of the story. It's only the doorway to complication. There's also a flag, she said, an attempted inquiry, about 6 months after your grandfather passed. I looked up inquiry. Yes, someone asked whether the account could be accessed without the passbook, claimed it had been lost. I didn't ask who, I didn't need to. They were denied, she continued. But the request is logged and reviewed. By whom? I asked. She paused, the branch manager at the time. The name she gave me was unfamiliar, but I wrote it down anyway. What mattered wasn't who he was, it was that there was a witness, a paper trail, a decision made and recorded. What happens now? I asked. She folded her hands. That depends on whether you want to access the account or investigate interference. The word interference echoed softly in my mind. I thanked her and left without making a request. On the way out, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. I looked composed. Thoughtful, exactly how I needed to look. What I didn't know then was that the bank manager, the one who denied my mother, was still with the company, promoted, respected, and that he remembered everything. That knowledge would change the shape of what came next. I didn't go back to the bank right away. Knowing something and proving it are very different acts, and I had learned the cost of confusing the two. Instead, I let the information settle, arranging it mentally the way my grandfather had taught me, facts first, interpretations later. At home, my mother grew restless. I noticed it in small ways, how often she asked where I was going, how she lingered near my laptop when I worked, how she casually mentioned money as if testing the ground. You know, she said one evening, stirring a pot she wasn't really watching, inheritances ruin families. I looked up from my book, only when people fight over them. She smiled thinly, or when expectations aren't managed. That was when I realized she didn't think she'd done anything wrong. In her mind, she'd managed something, cleaned it up, protected us from greed, from conflict, from me. I scheduled a second meeting with the bank, this time requesting to speak directly with the branch manager, the current one. When I arrived, I was shown into a glass-walled office overlooking the lobby. It was deliberately transparent. Institutions do that when they want conversations to remain civil. The manager was a man in his late 40s, careful with his expressions. He shook my hand and gestured for me to sit. I understand you have questions about a legacy account, he said. Yes, I replied, and about an inquiry made after my grandfather's death. His eyes flicked briefly to the door, then back to me. That was before my tenure here, he said carefully, but I've reviewed the file. I placed the photocopy of the passbook on the desk between us. Then you know it wasn't lost. He didn't touch it. I know someone claimed it was, and that you denied access, I said. Yes, why? He leaned back slightly, because the instructions were explicit. The beneficiary was named, and because the person requesting access couldn't answer questions only the account holder would know. Did you suspect wrongdoing? I asked. He studied me for a moment. I suspected urgency disguised as entitlement. That phrasing mattered. It was professional, neutral. But it told me he'd seen through her tone, even if he hadn't known her intentions. I'm not here to withdraw the money, I said. Not yet. His eyebrows rose a fraction. Then what are you here for? To understand my options, I said. If someone attempted to interfere with an inheritance, he nodded slowly, then you should know that documented attempts to misrepresent ownership can have consequences, especially when the beneficiary was deliberately concealed. Concealed by whom? I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. When I left the bank, I felt the shape of the story solidifying. Not as revenge, never that, but as correction. My mother had counted on silence, on confusion, on my reluctance to disrupt the family narrative she'd curated so carefully. She had underestimated two things, my patience and my grandfather's foresight. I requested certified copies of every document related to the account. I asked for internal memos, inquiry logs, timestamps. I kept everything in a folder I never brought home. At the same time, I began documenting my mother's version of events, casually, gently. I asked questions I already knew the answers to. Do you remember what Grandpa said about his savings? He didn't have any, she'd reply. Are you sure? Absolutely. Each denial added weight to the truth waiting behind it. The confrontation I knew couldn't happen privately. Private confrontations dissolve into emotion. This needed structure, witnesses, authority. What I didn't tell myself yet but understood intuitively was that once the truth was spoken aloud, there would be no way back to the family I thought I had. I wasn't afraid of that. I was afraid of letting the lie stand. The meeting took place in a room my mother would never have chosen. Neutral walls, neutral furniture, the kind of space designed to keep emotions from echoing. The bank had arranged it after I formally requested a beneficiary verification and interference review. They had insisted on it being conducted with all involved parties present. My mother arrived 10 minutes late. She looked confident when she walked in, dressed carefully, posture upright, expression composed. She smiled at the bank manager as if this were a courtesy appointment, something minor she was indulging. I remained seated. The manager began by outlining the purpose of the meeting. His tone was procedural, measured. He referred to documents, dates, and policies, never once to motives. That restraint was intentional. It gave the facts room to breathe. "We are here," he said, "to clarify ownership of a dormant legacy account and address a prior inquiry made under contested circumstances." My mother nodded. "I assumed this was about closing things properly," she said. "My father didn't leave anything complicated." I felt the old familiar pressure in my chest, but it didn't rise. I let it sit. The manager slid a document across the table toward her. "This is a record of an inquiry made 6 months after your father's passing." She glanced at it briefly. "Yes. I was settling affairs. I was told there was nothing there." "That is not accurate," he said calmly. "You were told you could not access the account without the passbook or beneficiary authorization." Her smile thinned. "Those things get lost." I spoke then, quietly. "They do. Unless they're hidden." She turned toward me sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means," the manager said before I could respond, "that the account was never abandoned, never closed, and never intended for general estate distribution." He placed another document on the table. "This is the beneficiary designation. It names your daughter." The room changed, not dramatically, just enough. My mother's gaze flicked to me, then back to the paper. "That can't be right," she said. "I would have known." "You did know," I said. "You just decided it didn't matter." Her breath caught. "That's not, the passbook was not destroyed," the manager continued. "It was retained and concealed." She looked at him now, truly looked. "You can't prove that." I slid a photograph across the table. The passbook, exactly as it had been found, the cloth. "The attic dust, you told me you threw it away," I said. "You told everyone." Silence followed, the kind that exposes rather than accuses. The manager folded his hands. "There is also the matter of misrepresentation," he said. "Claiming loss of documentation to attempt access constitutes interference." My mother's voice rose then, sharp and unguarded. "I was protecting my family." "No," I said. "You were controlling it." She stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. That money should have been part of the estate. It was never meant to be," the manager said. "Your father made that clear." Her composure cracked, not into hysteria, but into something more revealing, indignation stripped of justification. "He was manipulated," she said. "She was always his favorite." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The manager concluded the meeting with formal language. The account would be released to me, the interference noted, further action left open. As we left the room, my mother didn't look at me, not once. I watched her walk away and felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of alignment. Things returning to where they had been placed before someone decided to rearrange them. What I didn't yet understand was how this exposure would ripple outward, how truth, once validated, refuses to stay contained. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They rarely do. They unfold in patterns, revealing themselves slowly, the way structural damage does, first a crack, then a shift, then a collapse no one can pretend is sudden. My mother stopped calling. At first, I thought it was strategic. Silence as punishment had always been one of her preferred tools. But days passed, then weeks. When mutual relatives mentioned her, their tone had changed, careful, lowered, as if navigating a story whose ending they were still afraid to speak aloud. The bank moved efficiently. The account was transferred into my name, no ceremony, no apology attached. I didn't touch the money. Not immediately. I let it sit exactly where my grandfather had left it. It felt important not to rush what had waited decades. What I did receive, unexpectedly, was a letter. It came from the bank's legal department, formal in language, restrained in implication. They informed me that due to documented misrepresentation and attempted interference, an internal compliance review had been completed. No criminal charges were being pursued, but the incident had been recorded permanently. In institutional terms, that was severe. I folded the letter and placed it in the same folder as everything else. Evidence doesn't need to be displayed to exist. My father called one evening, his voice tired. He didn't ask about the money, he asked about the meeting. "She told me you ambushed her," he said. "I didn't," I replied. "I corrected her." He was quiet for a moment. "She says you went behind her back." "I went in front of the truth," I said. "She just wasn't there." He sighed. "She thought she knew what was best." "So did Grandpa," I said gently, "and he planned accordingly." That was the end of that conversation. Some people don't want resolution. They want stability, even if it's built on omission. The first time I saw my mother after the meeting was at a family gathering months later. She looked smaller somehow, not diminished, just stripped of certainty. She avoided me, spoke loudly to others, laughed too quickly. At one point, she cornered me near the kitchen. "You didn't need to humiliate me," she said under her breath. "I didn't," I replied. "You did that when you lied." Her eyes flashed. "You think this makes you righteous?" "No," I said. "It makes me accurate." She turned away then, the conversation over. I understood finally that she wasn't angry about the money. She was angry about exposure, about being seen clearly after years of controlling the lens. Later that night, alone in my car, I allowed myself a moment of grief. Not for the relationship we'd lost that had been eroding for years, but for the one I'd hoped might exist underneath the manipulation. What I didn't know then was that my grandfather had anticipated even this fracture. That he'd left me more than money. He'd left me proof that restraint and foresight outlast force. I began to understand that inheritance isn't just about assets, it's about values that survive interference. I didn't spend the money for a long time. Not out of fear and not out of sentimentality either. I left it untouched because I wanted to understand it, not its value, but its intention. My grandfather had been deliberate in everything. I doubted he'd wanted the account to simply change hands and dissolve into convenience. So I went back to his notes. In a box I'd taken months earlier, there were ledgers, journals, and folded papers marked with dates rather than titles. He hadn't written confessions or instructions. He'd written observations about markets, yes, but also about people, about patience. About what happens when authority goes unchallenged for too long. One entry stood out. It wasn't about the account directly. It was about my mother. He'd written that she was efficient, persuasive, and dangerously convinced that her judgment should replace consent. He didn't condemn her. He didn't excuse her either. He simply acknowledged a pattern. And then in a later entry, he wrote, "I won't argue with her about this. I'll outlast her." That sentence reframed everything. The account wasn't hidden because he feared confrontation. It was hidden because he understood leverage. He understood that power reveals itself not when it is granted, but when it is denied. I met with a financial advisor recommended by the bank, someone older, careful, unimpressed by drama. I told him the history without embellishment. He listened without interrupting. "She didn't expect you to be patient," he said when I finished. "No," I agreed. "She expected me to be grateful or confused." He nodded. "That's often the mistake." We structured the funds slowly, conservatively, nothing flashy, nothing that would announce itself at family gatherings or inspire commentary. Stability was the point, not spectacle. Still, word traveled. I began to notice a shift in how people spoke to me. Not admiration, something quieter, caution, as if they'd learned that my silence wasn't ignorance and my calm wasn't compliance. My mother, on the other hand, retreated into explanations. To relatives, to friends, to herself. She reframed the story so many times that each version contradicted the last. She was the victim. She was the protector. She was misunderstood. She never once said she was wrong. That realization settled something in me. Closure doesn't come from apology. It comes from clarity. The final interaction we had was brief. She called unexpectedly and asked to meet. We sat at a cafe neither of us liked, neutral territory again. "I hope you're happy," she said. "I'm at peace," I replied. She scoffed. "You could have handled it differently." "Yes," I said, "I could have let it go." Her eyes searched mine, waiting for regret. She found none. "He turned you against me," she said quietly. "No," I said. "He trusted me." That ended it. I walked away knowing the story would continue without my participation. People like my mother don't stop revising history, they just lose their audience. What I didn't know until much later was that the bank manager had kept a copy of my grandfather's instructions pinned inside his personal file, not out of obligation, but respect. He told a colleague once that it was the cleanest act of foresight he'd ever seen, a man who knew exactly who he was dealing with and trusted time to do the rest. The months after that meeting passed with an odd serenity. I no longer had to look over my shoulder or measure my words. I had the account, yes, but more importantly, I had the certainty that no one could manipulate me through omission or misinformation again. My grandfather's gift had never been about money. It had been about foresight, patience, and restraint. Work became a sanctuary. I threw myself into projects that required focus, calculation, and quiet observation. People confided in me, unaware of the lessons I'd absorbed. I listened, I cataloged, I learned who was trustworthy and who wasn't. And then, almost casually, the ripple effect began. Small things first, subtle shifts in family gatherings. Cousins who once ignored me now hesitated before contradicting me. Relatives who had once reveled in my mother's narratives began asking questions that made her falter. A single comment from an uncle, a carefully posed question from a distant cousin, it all reinforced what I had quietly understood. Truth has gravity, even if it takes time to reveal itself. My mother noticed it too. Her reassurances to herself became quieter, her stories less confident. She began to double-check facts before speaking, an unfamiliar habit. I realized then that her real anger wasn't at me or at my grandfather. It was at the inevitability of consequences she had never considered. One evening, I received a call from the bank. The manager, now nearing retirement, wanted to meet. He had a look in his eyes that spoke of unspoken stories, of lessons carried silently through decades. "I've been following your handling of the account," he said when we met. I don't think he could have trusted it to anyone better. I nodded, saying nothing, aware that the weight of his approval meant more than any praise my mother could give. He leaned back. Most people would have cashed it out or made a show. He didn't want that. He wanted restraint, patience, observation. "You've done more than follow instructions. You've understood intent." I felt a strange calm, a recognition that I had not only honored my grandfather but had grown into someone he would have approved of. That night I revisited the passbook one last time. It was a simple, unassuming document, worn at the edges. I held it carefully, turning the pages, reading numbers that now seemed almost secondary to what they represented: foresight, trust, and strategy. The weight of it was not in the sums, but in the understanding it demanded. I realized then that life itself was a ledger. Every action, every omission, every word, it accumulated. Most people never see the balance until it's too late. My grandfather had given me not money, but the ability to read the numbers correctly. I began making small changes, not dramatic ones, not visible ones, strategic ones, ensuring that my life, my decisions, and my relationships were guided not by impulse, resentment, or ego, but by clarity and calculated patience. And yet, even with all that calm, I knew the world outside didn't wait for the patient. People like my mother would continue to act impulsively, driven by ego, ignorance, or self-interest. But I had learned that patience can outlast all of that. That timing is often the most potent form of influence. For the first time in my life, I understood the difference between winning and being right. Winning was fleeting. Being right, grounded in truth and intention, was lasting. I looked at the passbook again, then set it aside. Not as an afterthought, not as a relic, but as a reminder that foresight, patience, and clarity were more valuable than any sum of money, and that the quiet, controlled, strategic path often leads to the most devastating and just outcomes. Months turned into a full year. The ripple effect of the passbook's revelation reached further than I could have imagined. My mother, once the uncontested narrator of every family story, found herself navigating conversations cautiously. Every boast, every assumption, every hidden slight she had relied upon to assert control now met subtle, unspoken scrutiny. People didn't challenge her openly, but they questioned, probed, and hesitated, and she felt it keenly. I noticed a shift in my cousins and extended family too. They had grown accustomed to my mother's version of events, to her authority and her interpretations of truth. But now, with the passbook and the bank's acknowledgement, they began looking at me differently. Not with awe, exactly not yet, but with a quiet respect, an unspoken acknowledgement that I was not to be discounted. It was during a Sunday gathering, one of those routine family lunches, that the full scope of change revealed itself. My mother was recounting a story about some minor family scandal from years ago, embellishing the details to cast herself in the most favorable light. I listened quietly, as I always did, my voice calm and measured when I finally spoke. "You're forgetting a detail," I said softly, almost conversationally. "That makes your version incomplete." There was a pause, a single blink too long. Every eye in the room turned toward me. My mother's lips tightened. "Oh, and what detail would that be?" I smiled slightly, not mockingly, but with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "The part where you destroyed the passbook, where you misrepresented what Grandpa intended. You left out how the bank actually handled it and the consequences that followed." The room went quiet, not a forced silence, not the polite pause people use to reset conversations, but a real, heavy silence. My words landed with a weight that no argument or denial could counter. And then the most subtle but devastating moment occurred. My mother faltered, not dramatically, not theatrically, just a brief hesitation, a subtle shift in posture, an almost imperceptible glance toward the others in the room. She had lost control. Not publicly, not loudly, but the authority she relied on, the narrative she used as leverage, had cracked. I continued, calm, reflective, measured. Grandpa didn't give gifts to be hidden or destroyed. He gave them to be honored, understood, and when the time was right, to teach lessons. I honored his intent. That's why the bank recognized it properly and why the truth stands where it always should have. No shouting, no accusations, just truth delivered with precision, patience, and clarity. After that day, my mother's attempts to assert dominance became less frequent. She still spoke, of course, but her words no longer carried the same unquestioned weight. She began to calculate, to hesitate, to measure. It was almost imperceptible, but for me, it was confirmation. The balance had shifted. Meanwhile, I found myself reflecting more and more on the concept of control. I had always been reactive, always emotionally bound to the whims of others' actions and judgments. But the passbook had taught me a fundamental principle. control is never in reaction, it is in preparation, observation, and timing. I started journaling again, meticulously noting every decision, every interaction, every subtle shift in behavior I observed. I cataloged patterns, predicted reactions, and refined my approach to relationships, family, and even work. The world no longer felt chaotic. It felt like a board game when I was learning to play with quiet mastery. And yet I never gloated, I never flaunted the shift. Patience is most powerful when invisible. Influence is strongest when it's unseen. The world believed my mother still held sway, but in truth, the balance of power had quietly shifted irrevocably, and I alone understood the full depth of that change. It was then that I realized the final lesson of the passbook. It was never about money or even revenge. It was about comprehension of people, of timing, of restraint, of patience, and those who fail to grasp it, no matter how loud they are, will always be at the mercy of those who do. The final confrontation didn't come with drama or spectacle. There was no shouting, no public humiliation. It was quiet, controlled, inevitable, like the final move in a game that had been played for months without anyone noticing the strategy unfolding. It happened at the bank, the very place that had validated Grandpa's intent, the space where the truth had quietly but decisively emerged. I had called an appointment under the guise of discussing some administrative matter, but my real purpose was subtle, deliberate closure. My mother had accompanied me, naturally assuming she still held some invisible sway over the situation. The bank manager greeted us with the same polite professionalism as before, but this time there was a shift in tone, a recognition, unspoken yet undeniable. He addressed me directly, using my name and referring to the passbook, the inheritance, and the documentation that had remained meticulously intact. Every detail, every transaction, every clarification was recounted clearly, calmly, and most importantly, publicly. I watched my mother. Her composure was tight, rehearsed, but it faltered. Not with rage, not with words, but with those small, revealing gestures. A quick glance at me, a hesitation before responding, the briefest tightening of her grip on her purse. She realized, finally, that her narrative had no ground to stand on here. Not at the bank, not in front of witnesses, not in any context where the truth could be verified. The manager concluded, with firm clarity, all actions were in accordance with Mr. Grandpa's last name's wishes. The passbook, though misplaced, has been fully honored. The intended distribution and recognition have been completed. Silence filled the room, not dramatic silence, no one gasped, but the kind of silence that speaks volumes. My mother's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Words failed her. And in that brief moment, I understood the full extent of what had shifted. She had relied on deception, but truth has an uncanny way of asserting itself when given the proper stage. As we left the bank, I felt the weight of closure settle over me. There was no gloating, there was no triumph in someone else's defeat, just a calm acknowledgement of the facts, a reflection on the patience and intelligence that had guided every decision, every observation, every strategic step along the way. In the weeks and months that followed, family gatherings became quieter, more measured. Conversations no longer carried the undertones of unquestioned authority from my mother. People listened, they observed, and I, who had once been reactive, now moved with intention. The lessons of the passbook had reached their full impact. Understanding human behavior, exercising patience, and waiting for the right moment to act, these were tools far more powerful than anger or recklessness. I sometimes think about Grandpa. About the quiet wisdom in his gesture, in leaving something so small yet so consequential, knowing it would reveal character, patience, and understanding over time. He taught me that justice is often subtle, that control is not in force but in foresight, and that true resolution comes not from shouting or confrontation, but from the quiet, unwavering application of principle. And so I walk forward with clarity, patience, and a calm understanding of human nature. The passbook, this simple, unassuming document, was never about money. It was about foresight, integrity, and the quiet execution of truth. And in honoring it, I honored not just my grandfather, but the strength, patience, and intelligence within myself. I never needed anyone to witness my strategy. The impact was always felt, even in silence. That is the lesson I carry now, that quiet, deliberate, and patient action always leaves the deepest mark, because some truths, once unearthed, cannot be buried again.